It started as just another quiet morning at my oceanfront cottage. The waves rolled in softly, the air was fresh with that salty scent I loved, and the sun was casting golden light across the water. This place had been my escape for years. Little slice of peace away from the chaos of the city. But that peace didn't last long. A knock at the door broke the calm, and when I opened it, 2 members of our HOA stood there with clipboards and fake smiles. They told me they needed the keys to my cottage for a few days to do some supposed maintenance inspections. It didn't make sense. I'd never heard of any such rule, and my place wasn't due for repairs. I asked what exactly they planned to do inside, but their answers were vague, too vague. Something about checking for structural integrity and ensuring compliance. I knew my cottage was in perfect condition. The whole thing felt off. So I politely refused and told them I wasn't comfortable handing over my keys. Their smiles faded instantly, replaced by a look that said I had just made things complicated for them. For the next few days, I noticed strange things. A car parked down the street with people sitting inside for hours, footsteps outside late at night. When the tide drowned out most other sounds, even the feeling that someone was watching my place from the dunes. The HOA president sent me a curt email saying I was obstructing necessary community procedures, which only made me more suspicious. Then, one night, I woke up to a faint noise, metal against metal, right at my front door. My heart started pounding as I realized it wasn't the wind. Someone was trying to get in. And when I peeked through the window, I saw exactly who it was. It was the HOA president himself, crouched low with another board member beside him, fiddling with my lock like they were trying not to be seen. I stepped back from the window, my mind racing. Why would they go to these lengths just to get inside my oceanfront cottage? I had lived here for years without a single issue, paying my dues, keeping everything in perfect condition. Sure, the HOA could be strict about things like paint colors and lawn care. But this was on a whole different level. The president, Richard, had always been polite on the surface. But there was something about him I never quite trusted. He had a way of looking at the cottages along this stretch like they were assets he personally owned, not homes where people lived. His right-hand board member, Susan, was even worse, always gossiping at community meetings and keeping track of everyone's comings and goings. I remembered the week before, overhearing them at the marina talking about needing access to certain properties before the end of the month. At the time, I thought it was about routine inspections, but now that didn't seem so innocent. They'd asked me for my keys, without a proper explanation, and when I said no, they didn't drop it. Over the next few days, I started noticing even more odd behavior. My neighbor, who usually waved and chatted when I passed, suddenly avoided eye contact. Another resident hinted that the HOA had been restructuring certain properties for a new project, but clammed up when I asked questions. There were also rumors about a developer sniffing around for prime spots along the shoreline. My cottage, with its direct beach access and unobstructed views, would be exactly the kind of place they'd want. Now, standing inside with my heart pounding and the sound of my doorknob being tampered with, I knew this was bigger than a simple misunderstanding. Something was going on, and they weren't just going to walk away if I told them to stop. In that moment, I realized I had to decide: stay hidden and hope they left, or confront them head-on and risk finding out exactly what they were after. I stayed frozen, every muscle tense, listening as the soft scrape of metal against the lock continued. My phone was in my hand, but I hesitated to call the police. This was my own HOA, the people who were supposed to protect the neighborhood. If I called law enforcement and nothing came of it, I knew they'd make my life here miserable. But if I did nothing, they might feel bold enough to come back again and again until they got what they wanted. The sound stopped for a moment, and I heard hushed whispers outside. I couldn't make out every word, but I caught phrases like deadline. And before the appraisal, my pulse quickened. Appraisal. That word alone confirmed my suspicion they were after my property for some kind of deal. Maybe they planned to sell it out from under me. Maybe they were setting up some kind of redevelopment project. Either way, it was clear I wasn't part of their plan. Across the street, I noticed a light flicker in my neighbor Alan's house. He was one of the few people I trusted here, an older fisherman who'd lived on the coast his entire life. We'd shared beers on my porch plenty of times, swapping stories about storms and tides. But lately, even Alan had been distant. I wondered if the HOA had gotten to him too, or if he knew something he was afraid to tell me. Meanwhile, small details kept adding to the unease. A stack of community notices showed up in my mailbox with warnings about compliance penalties. My trash bins were mysteriously tipped over 2 mornings in a row. Someone even left a note on my doorstep, no signature. Just the words, "It will be easier if you cooperate." I felt like I was being boxed in, pressured from every side. The cottage that once felt like a sanctuary now felt like a target. And as I heard footsteps crunching away from my door that night, I knew they weren't finished with me. This wasn't over, it was only just beginning. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of voices outside. They weren't loud, but they carried over the quiet crash of the waves. Peeking through the blinds, I saw Richard, Susan, and 2 other board members gathered by my gate, speaking in quick, urgent tones. One of them was holding a folder thick with papers, and every so often, they glanced toward my cottage like they were measuring it with their eyes. I stayed out of sight, but my heart was pounding. It wasn't just a break-in attempt anymore. They were planning something bigger. I thought about the word appraisal I'd overheard and how the HOA had been oddly secretive about recent community changes. My mind kept circling back to the possibility that they were trying to take control of prime oceanfront properties, maybe to flip them for a developer. If that was true, my refusal to hand over the keys might have thrown a wrench into a much larger plan. That night, I decided to set up a small camera by the porch, hidden near the railing. I needed proof of what they were doing. I also reached out to Alan, hoping he might finally tell me what he knew. When he answered his door, his eyes darted nervously down the street before letting me in. He spoke in a low voice, telling me he'd heard talk at the marina about the HOA acquiring certain homes through compliance violations and forced access. He warned me they wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted. Later, as I reviewed the camera feed from earlier in the day, my stomach twisted. The footage showed Richard himself walking up to my door while Susan kept watch. He bent down, and I could hear the faint click of tools again. But this time, it wasn't just the door. They were trying to open the lock on my side window. It was then I realized they weren't waiting for me to give permission. They were coming in whether I was ready or not. And judging by the way they moved, it was going to happen sooner than I thought. The next day, I thought I'd keep a low profile, but fate had other plans. Just before noon, I got a letter slid under my door. No envelope, no official HOA stamp, just a folded sheet of paper with a short message scrawled in neat handwriting. "We have the authority." Tonight, my stomach dropped. I didn't know if it was a threat, a warning, or both, but one thing was clear: they weren't bluffing anymore. I spent the afternoon checking every lock and latch, making sure the windows were secured. While I was doing that, I noticed something I hadn't seen before: bright orange surveyor's markings sprayed along the edge of my property. At first, I thought it was random graffiti, but then I saw the same markings on 2 other cottages down the beach, both belonging to neighbors who had moved out recently. That's when it hit me. This wasn't just about my home. They were targeting a stretch of oceanfront, maybe even the whole row. Just as I was processing that, Alan showed up, looking pale and uneasy. He told me something he hadn't shared before, One of the acquired cottages was now owned by a shell company, and rumor had it the HOA was tied to it. He also admitted he'd seen strangers going in and out at odd hours, people who didn't live in the neighborhood. That evening, I checked the footage from my porch camera again, and my blood ran cold. Around midnight the night before, someone had been on my property who wasn't part of the HOA, at least not anyone I recognized. They wore dark clothing, moved with precision, and seemed to be inspecting the outside walls of my cottage. The strangest part? Richard and Susan were standing back at the dunes, watching silently, almost like they were overseeing the whole thing. It wasn't just the HOA anymore. Someone else was involved. And whoever they were, they looked like professionals. The kind who don't knock. The kind who just take. That night, I didn't bother sleeping. I kept the lights low, my camera ready, and my phone in my pocket. The ocean outside was calm, but every creak in the floorboards made my pulse race. Just after midnight, I caught movement by the dunes. Two figures in dark clothing crept toward my cottage, with Richard and Susan trailing behind at a distance. They moved fast and quietly, heading straight for the side window they had tried before. I waited until they were just about to pry it open before stepping out onto the porch, shining a bright flashlight right in their faces. "Smile," I said, holding up my phone, the camera already recording. They froze, and for a split second, I saw genuine shock. Richard stepped forward, trying to play it off. "This is an authorized inspection," he stammered. But the two strangers didn't say a word. Instead, they exchanged a quick look, then started to back away. That's when I heard sirens in the distance. Earlier, I had sent a copy of my camera footage and the strange letter to a friend in the sheriff's department. I'd told him if I called after midnight, it wasn't for a social visit. The deputies arrived fast, lights flooding the beach. The strangers were caught before they reached the dunes, and Richard and Susan were pulled aside for questioning. Turns out the professionals were private contractors hired by a developer looking to secure prime oceanfront lots by any means necessary. The HOA had been promised a cut if they helped push owners out. It should have ended there. But the real twist came the next morning. While the deputies were still going through evidence, Alan walked over, looking more relieved than I'd ever seen him. "I've got something you need to see," he said, handing me an old file folder. Inside were property deeds, half of them in the name of the same shell company, and one of those deeds was for my cottage, signed and dated 2 weeks ago. According to their paperwork, I'd already sold my home. And that meant this fight wasn't over. It was just moving to a much bigger stage. I stared at the deed in disbelief. My signature was there, but I'd never signed anything. The ink, the notary stamp, even the date, it all looked real. The deputies confirmed what I already knew. It was a forged document. The developer, working with the HOA, had filed it quietly at the county office, betting that by the time I found out, I'd already be gone. With the evidence from my cameras, the threatening note, Alan's folder of deeds, and the footage of the break-in attempt, the sheriff's department opened a full investigation. Richard, Susan, and the two contractors were charged with multiple counts, including trespassing and fraud. The developer's name started popping up in local news, and the scandal spread fast through the community. Neighbors who had stayed silent began speaking up, revealing how they'd been pressured, fined, or threatened into leaving their homes. It took weeks of paperwork, court filings, and sleepless nights, but the forged sale of my cottage was officially voided. Standing on my porch one evening, watching the sun sink into the water, I finally felt that peace I'd almost lost. Alan came by with a beer, and we talked about how close we'd come to losing not just our homes, but the spirit of the community we'd built. The HOA was dissolved, replaced with a small, Unerun association that focused on keeping the beach clean and safe instead of lining pockets. The developer backed off completely once the legal heat turned up. Looking back, The whole ordeal taught me something important. Protecting what's yours isn't just about locks and cameras. It's about standing your ground when people try to intimidate you. My oceanfront cottage wasn't just property. It was home. And I wasn't about to let anyone take it from me without a fight.